Uh, Rob, I'm really glad to have the opportunity to talk with you, especially about your book. As you know, I'm a child and adolescent and an addiction psychiatrist. And so um, I'll say what I've told some of the medical students about your book, that if even a quarter of your book is accurate, we in the profession should be ashamed to be a part of it. It really hits home. Anyone, myself in training and over the years, sees it. We've had to be a part of it, even when we would try to stand up and make it different. And as a psychiatrist, is how do you manage being in a system like this when you see it and not fall into practicing it as much as possible? So my practice has always been sort of out of the norm, looking at the person, looking at the limitations of diagnosis and the whole problem. So I just wanted to tell you that this just is humbling and very important for the mental health profession to at least look at seriously.
Yeah, thank you. And unfortunately, yeah, much more than a quarter of it's accurate.
Sort of
But yeah, and that is, in all seriousness, right? The pain of it, I think, for all of us is at times I am wishing it wasn't, and I wish some of this. One of the choices I made as a writer when I was working on the book was not to include things that as far as I could tell were really rare. Maybe it was extreme. It would have been sensational kind of story, but I thought that seems like unusual. This was a particularly abusive institution or person. And so I didn't include those stories. I included ones that I thought really did reflect things that one way or another I could verify were fairly common, and that to me is one of the most disturbing elements of the book.
And that's what I appreciated about the book, that you did have some extremes, but you didn't stick with the extremes. And that makes me ask you a question, because you have a very broad perspective of the field, from personal experience, family experience, and all the research that you've done and the different people you've talked to. One of the things I have to struggle with, that I hear, especially when extremes are talked about, how much do you, if you could take it in some detail, how much do you feel that the field of mental health fundamentally is bad or wrong in its foundation versus it's just bad care?
Bad in its
Bad care,
I
meaning
see. Yeah,
how,
interesting question.
meaning not what it is, but how it's taught, how it's applied, and how it's maybe misapplied.
Very interesting question. I love that question. I think that's really worth exploring, because a lot of people have said to me that I interviewed patients, gosh, if they had just been nicer, if they had just been a little bit more honest about these medications, what they could do and not do, if they had just told me that the diagnoses were flexible and loose and the science wasn't clear, but maybe I would find this helpful to think of it in these terms, it would have been fine. Like a lot of people said, like if they had just been nicer in the experience. And I think that's worthy of note, right? Because between niceness, respectfulness, collaboration, you go a really long way. And then if you go further, and agency, right? And you give me that. So it's like, Rob, I'm just here to work with you. I'm here to be your ally. Based on my experience, what can I offer you? What can I give you? And I'm allowed to pick and choose what I'm finding helpful. And you get that back. You're like, okay, Rob finds that useful. And you can work with that, right? I think that would be transformative in and of itself, right? We wouldn't have to change anything else.
Just how it's practiced.
How it's practiced.
By the psychiatrist, by the therapist, by anyone in the system.
Absolutely. And that's why I think that question you've raised is so important, because a lot of people say that to me, and I see it too. And somehow the opposite has happened. And that is that it's becoming meaner, crueler, more cynical. I see bitterness in practitioners a lot. I don't see niceness, and that's what patients are running into as well. So I think that's huge. So for me, and that is one of the things I sort of campaign around for the book, is just honesty, more honesty and transparency across the system, because that will be a step in the right direction. I mean, I do, as you know, talk about many things in the book where there are questions around the science of the diagnoses, how effective these treatments are, and I think all of that is important. But gosh, if we just had true informed consent going on in the system, that would be a huge leap forward in and of itself.
Yeah. I spent some time last night going through parts of your book, and I was struck by things very different than when I had read it months ago. Somewhere you referred to, and I think this was your words, that you said this chapter is about the dark heart of the mental health system. And you used the word heart. We have lost our heart. We have lost our compassion in many ways, as you say. We're maybe meaner. We're not as nice. Maybe we can go into it sometime. But psychiatry and mental health, we've lost what it all started with. We've lost our soul.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? And you can tell me what the trajectory of your career was. But for example, Kernan Mannion, who's in my book, is a psychiatrist, and and he talks about how inspiring he found reading incredible books by psychiatrists that he was reading back in the 60s and early 70s, and that's what made him want to become a psychiatrist, was that it was going to be about exploring, about maximizing human potential, all that we can be together, and all these kinds of things. And then within his own lifetime, within his career, he saw this much more dramatic turn towards medicalization and billing related to medicalization. He no longer could take the time with patients, and he found it actually kind of distressing and upsetting, and he became really burned out. And then he discovered that lots of his colleagues were feeling this way too, and he kind of lived that transition into a much more medicalized approach to this. And many doctors who have been around a long time in our society today have been kind of telling me that story, that they witnessed the transition from a more kind of therapeutic environment and one of more collaboration between psychiatrists and patients than this more sort of aggressive and pathologizing, medicalizing approach that we take today. And is that something you've witnessed as well?
I was just going to say, let me share a little. I've been in the field long enough that when I entered medical school, I knew I wanted to be a psychiatrist. And they trained us as medical students to be psychiatrists. And the faculty were our friends, and we would go to their houses, and we would hear the compassion that they brought. And this was in the early 1970s, and medications were still not the priority. So I started my medical career in psychiatry, where it was not all about medications. And so I've sort of resisted that. And during my residency training in psychiatry, the DSM-3 came out. Overnight, the whole field changed. And it immediately became less psychological and more medicalized. And when that was added to the medications and new medications and all the money that goes into promoting that, psychiatrists no longer were with people. We were managing medications. We were managing the codes, the diagnoses, and whatever. And I think that's when we lost our heart and our soul. And we were no longer nice, because that wasn't the priority anymore.
Right.
The priority was lost.
Right, and that's what it seems that we don't have great data, and of course the data between the 1950s and today, is not the same at all. But from roughly that period, and I link it to the introduction of Prozac, really, at the late 80s and 90s, and the concept of the biochemical imbalance spreading across the culture. And with that, what we see in the data that we can get is that's when involuntary commitment definitely started increasing. So it seems that there's a direct linkage between this notion that, oh, we're curing some sort of disease with these drugs, and that notion and the idea that we can more readily justify using force to implement that. And to me, that problem has continued to this day. It seems that it's never been more medicalized, and the system has never been more aggressive.
And you mentioned Prozac, because as a psychiatrist, it's sort of been a struggle in my career regarding how much medication, how much is therapy. I pride my clinical work as I'm very good at determining what's biology and what's psychology. I'll tell you, my first job out of my training was to set up an inpatient adolescent addiction program. And we could lock the doors at that time for 3 months, and we had them contained. But I was told you cannot use any medications. It's going to be a 12-step program. And I said, okay, that's not how I'm trained. And we built it, we started it, and within 3 months, the patients ruled the ward. Mm-hmm. The 3 bipolar patients in manic episodes rallied everyone else, and we almost had a war. And all of the clinicians, all of the workers came up in a recovery, and they were against medications. So I said, sorry, we're using medications. Treated those 3 patients bipolar, put them on lithium, and in 2 weeks, they changed the whole thing. And people said, oh, maybe there is something about this medication piece. So I've had some of the extreme successes with medication, and then I've had some where I've tried 4 medications and nothing's working. Well, maybe I'm missing something. Like you mentioned, trauma. Mm-hmm. Can you say a little bit about how you see trauma and the unrecognized and carefully unwell treatment of trauma might be part of what's confusing the whole system? Makes us become very biological and very afraid.
Yeah, well, we certainly know there's lots of studies showing that a very high percentage of people coming into the mental health system, and particularly psychiatric hospitals, have some sort of severe trauma in their background, often linked to things that can be verified. So we know that's there. And then what I found through my research is that often they're being re-traumatized by these very aggressive interventions. Yes. Yeah. So the interventions tend to mimic some of the most common ways that these people were abused if they had childhood abuse. So the use of security guards, restraints, force stripping, all these common elements of aggressive force treatment often leave people much more traumatized. And in fact, one of the most distressing things that I hear, and I hear it consistently, is even from people who've personally experienced sexual assault, childhood physical assault, will say, my experience in the psychiatric hospital was worse.
I could believe it.
Yeah, and that's very
heartbreaking.
Yeah, and I think, to me, like, that's shocking to me. I'm a journalist, I report that in my book, but I would think that the entire profession would be up in arms about itself and about forced treatment in this context, saying, how can we possibly work in an environment where this has become routine? And it's something that, like I say, I can just put that out on Twitter tomorrow, and there will be 100 patients who respond, and I don't even have that many followers, but who'll say, that happened to me. I know this because I did it a few weeks ago. I just mentioned it, and it was like, that's how I feel. That's how I feel. That's how I feel. And so it's easy to find this, and how can anyone practice in that? That's what I don't understand.
How can we continue when we all see it?
Why is it me bringing this up, right? Why are psychiatrists like, oh my God, we can't practice in this kind of environment. How can we do a good job?
So let me take it into maybe a darker area, because the whole country is struggling with systemic racism. Do you get any sense that this is oppression? And this is an oppression of the underclass, underprivileged, undermoneyed, underage, and overaged. Do you think that this in some way is just part of that, not necessarily racism, but extreme prejudice against people that actually, you know what? As soon as we put a diagnosis and make the diagnosis priority, it creates me and an other, and you as the other immediately become dehumanized. Do you get a sense that that's...
Yeah, that's one of the arguments I'm really trying to implicitly make with the book, and to some degree explicitly as well, but that I see the use of involuntary commitment powers, mental health law powers more generally, and that these are being used within the framework of a system that already has many aspects to it that are very prejudicial and oppressive for large swaths of the population. And this is becoming actually one of the dominant ways in which those oppressive impulses are able to be manifested, because these powers are so broad and so flexible. So that's one of the kind of sirens I'm trying to raise with the book, is that people need to be really mindful of this, that many institutions of power can utilize and are utilizing mental health laws more and more. And again, right, I come back to, it would seem to me that psychiatrists, medical professionals, people who work in the field should be the ones up in arms about this, right? Raising the alarm, because, it's obvious to anyone that looks like, hey, these drugs are being much more broadly used, in nursing homes, much more broadly used in schools, much more broadly used across the population. But instead, when I'm interviewing many people that work in the profession, they're often still justifying it. They're going, no, those people, they really are severely mentally ill. They really do need these treatments. And I'm like, but the need seemingly has been increasing quite dramatically. Per capita rates of psychiatric detention have been increasing a lot for decades now. Like, it doesn't look like we're using them as a last resort. How are we using them? We need to really look at that again.
And I think that's part of what really hurt in reading your book, that you make it clear that we are part of a system that's gotten out of control and that uses itself as oppressive, as controlling, as violent. But you make me ask the question myself, why are there not psychiatrists up in arms? I'll share with you. So I think about it. When I started in my career, I could spend time and talk with a patient. I had the time. I didn't have all the demands. I didn't have 20-minute med checks and 30-minute evaluations. And the overwhelm that we have as psychiatrists has almost made us passive to everything else that's going on. Psychiatrists ourselves, we used to be in charge of programs. We're not anymore. There are administrators that tell us what to do and indirectly tell us how to practice psychiatry and how to practice medicine. And I think that's part of what has allowed the psychiatrists to sort of turn a deaf ear to some of these things. And if we speak up in the system, it isn't always looked at usefully, let's say.
Wow, that's powerful. Yeah, and you're reminding me that that's what Jonathan Gadsby, the nurse, psychiatric nurse in my book, said to me too. That he feels oppressed. He felt oppressed working in the environment. He's now a teacher, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And
we feel oppressed.
Yeah, and he said, I don't want to compare it. He doesn't want to say, oh, I as a nurse was as oppressed as the patient who is being involuntarily committed. He said, I don't want to say that, but I do think that it's correct to say that the liberation of nurses, is closely linked to the liberation of the psychiatric patient. It sounds like you're saying the same thing that
you
psychiatrists
really,
need to be liberated.
And you mentioned something. There's just such burnout in medicine and even in psychiatry that that might be part of it. That if we work in systems where we unconsciously or inadvertently feel oppressed over the years, it's like, why do I want to keep doing this? And that's interesting. That will bring me to another area. That's why probably about 30 years ago, I realized that spirituality was a saving grace. That if I could look at the nature of what's really important in people, if you use the word spirit, if you use the word soul, and connect with that, the older I've gotten, the more enjoyable my practice is. And I think I'm probably pretty rare because I've been in the field over 40 years, and it's more enjoyable now than it was 30 years ago. And I think that's because of the spiritual part. That when I can connect with that spiritual part and in any way help it to just wake up, to be there at the moment when that wakens, it's just so heartening. I'll keep working.
Right. Yeah, well, I mean...
So what do you mentioned that you met a lot of people that had spiritual experiences that were mishandled by the field, and that's part of what we want to do with the documentary. But the other part we want to emphasize with the documentary is spirituality and spiritual awakening and spiritual experiences should be promoted. That open, and some of the other people, I mean, Tammy, right? Was talking about connecting with that and bringing that liveness out. So can you say something more than just misunderstood spiritual experiences, which absolutely is a real problem in psychiatry, but the usefulness that you could see real spirituality may play in transforming the system? Or
yeah, it's tremendous. Like, I often start with myself with that example, because some of the people that I talk with whose lives went off the rails, and we'll trace it back to, like, when did that really start for you? And often they describe something which I understand as, and would have understood at the time, as a kind of spiritual moment in their lives of sudden insight, looking into the mirror and suddenly seeing many faces, and I'm thinking, oh, you're having a sense of oneness with different types of people that were inside you, and you were feeling that. But for them it was terrifying, and then they didn't get that reinforcement. Somebody saying, hey, this could be a really beautiful moment that you've just experienced, and let's explore it together, and what's going on for you in life that might have brought it about. Instead, they were pathologized, and they got afraid of it themselves. Oh my God, I have to repress it, and their whole lives went down a different route. And so that's what I see a lot is the people who like me, readily had that available and had support for it in our lives to go, this is part of, I saw it in spiritual terms, artistic terms as well. Yeah, I'm going to write about this. And that's going to be inspiring to people to read poetry about my transformative experience, right? That itself is a form of my engagement in the world, which I also see, I see art as a kind of spiritual expression. And so, yeah, and I've seen that in others as well. So when they find that pathway for them, right, and it can be spiritual, and I just even want to broaden that term out, because for some people they link that directly to religion, right. But I think we're meaning it in a broader sense, where it is just that potential for what does it really mean to be me, and how can I be different in my life and in my understanding of myself. And when I think whoever it is in their lives, right? It could be a psychiatrist, it could be a friend, it could be a child, it could be an animal that they interrelate with in some way, right? It can be just things that happen in their lives that open that up for them to go, oh, this isn't this isn't necessarily a bad thing that's happening to me. Maybe it's stressful. Maybe it's not well accommodating in the situation I'm in right now in my life, but there are opportunities there, and with support and with nurturing and with orientation, they can often find that as a pathway through those kind of powerful energies. That's what I call them, like a non-ordinary state, or it's like powerful energies emerging, and you can find ways to...
That's it. The non-ordinary state has a power of its own that we're suppressing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's an opportunity for sure. And certainly, like, we know that if that comes up at a difficult time when there isn't support around it.
Like in an emergency room.
Yeah, exactly. In an emergency room, or in the workplace where nobody's accepting of anything like that, or, you know, you're in a school that has no tolerance for any kind of, you know, whatever, or people just start interpreting you a strange way. Like, I think the mere fact that I identified myself as an artist early on in my life, it was a huge part of that, right? Because if I'd thought of myself as an engineer, I would have thought, what am I going to do with these energies? They're not helping my engineering right now at all. That's how I would have thought. They might have in the end, you know, like I think they could. But because I knew right away, like, oh yeah, I'm going to write like a character like this or whatever, it just always gave me a sense that of groundedness, you know, that allowed me then to kind of go into those danger zones that I think, had I been repressing that energy more, wouldn't have felt available. And I think that's the fear. I do believe, I want to say, you know, for any engineers out there, right, that I do believe you can have non-ordinary experiences and still be a great engineer. but you know, you need to be able to process feelings, right, and get through it. And I think that's sorely missing. And I think, you know, we go to other cultures, right? I think I've cited Stanislav Grof already. He's pointed that out, that almost every other culture except modern Western society, Europe and North America specifically, you know, almost every other culture historically and today still has spirituality and non-ordinary experiences kind of at the heart. Very
of the
revered,
culture.
Yeah, a very revered and important part. Rites of passage, you know, there's ways in which these are understood and nurtured, and oh, this is a transformative time of your life. How can we be there for you? You know, when the guru in India started going through a wacky time, everybody rallied around, ooh, the guru's transforming, you know, we have to like provide food and safety. And then an indigenous person that I interviewed told me that exact story. Oh, the big house, right? When people got into these extreme mental states, everybody rallied around to support and help. And it was like, wow, revered and nurtured. And instead in ours, you're kind of pulled out of your community, you're locked away, you're treated as if something really bad and dangerous is going on. And how can that but amplify your fears and paranoia?
Just the way you said that is a terrible image. It's as if we're squelching the soul of their creativity in doing what we're doing in the system.
Yeah, I don't want to say that because I don't think I don't know that it's as systemic as that, you know, and organized, but I do think
I don't think
happening.
It's intentional.
Right. It's not intentional.
No, I would agree. I don't think it's intentional at all.
But it's happening. It's definitely happening to a lot of people, and I think, yeah, like some of the people that I see, like, I mean, I say that all the time. It's weird, like out in the mainstream media, we see often people who are being treated against who are portrayed as if they almost like they have severe dementia, Alzheimer's. They don't know that they're ill, and people get this image that, oh, that's you know, yeah, like a person with severe dementia literally doesn't know who they are or where they are, and we know that is rarely, if ever, the case with just a pure psychiatric condition, right? Like schizophrenia or anxiety, depression, or any of these things. So. Yeah, like, you know, I find that in fact a lot of people who've been involuntarily committed seem to me to be above average in their intelligence, their creativity, their critique of the world, and things like that.
But they don't know the system, and they surrender to the system. The doctor knows best, or the family members have
some
them
do,
surrender.
and some fight it and get locked into.
Well,
a battle.
that's even worse.
Yeah.
I know we're looking at time, but I want to add just a few statements and then some questions. I have to bring out, there in your book you mentioned a person, Irit Shimrat?
Mm-hmm. Irit Shimrat.
Irit Shimrat? Yeah. Was that a man or a woman?
It's a woman, yeah.
A woman. She had a sentence in your book that I think just captured the whole thing, that she said that the system as she was hospitalized right, was crushing her creative soul. And the way she described her experience and what she was like before, what she was like after. Fortunately, she pulled out and learned to use it as a real creative part and transformation in her life. But that quote, that it was crushing her creative soul, I thought was important.
And I want to comment on, I mean, Ritz had become a dear friend to me. She was one of the first people I ever talked with about her involuntary commitment experiences. So I've known her for decades now. And, you know, she helped edit the book too, because she's a professional editor. And so I got feedback from her on every chapter, and that was really great. And, you know, it brings tears to my eyes, actually, that, because I know that struggle is still real for her, that she feels that her first commitment was when at age 20, and she was applying to school to be a creative writing program, and then her whole life kind of got derailed, and she does still feel that way, that it was a real crushing of who
it hit her
she.
at such a sensitive age when she was trying to step out.
Yeah, and she's always now, forever after, a sense of risk if she goes into her fantasy world in some way, and too deeply, too strongly, and also just the sense of anger and frustration that it left her with towards the system, right? That's also hard to grapple with, right? It's like you feel you've been brutalized by someone else, and it's hard for people to kind of get through that in the course of their lives, right? To really move on from it. And I think that to some degree, because she continues to witness the aggressiveness of the system, it's been hard for her to actually ever not feel angry about that.
And I think that really puts a point there. Was saying psychiatry may originally have been to look at the soul. I mean, the mistranslation of Sigmund Freud was, he was after the I, the soul, and when it came to American, was translated into English, it became mechanized. A book by Bruno Bettelheim, really, Freud and Man's Soul, really talks about that. But in my work with spirituality, for years, I rebelled against religion and whatever. So for me to be saying things I'm saying now in spirituality has really been just sort of a 180 degrees turn. We have an experience that really does fit the word soul. It's a moral core that is loving and compassionate, that steps into the world with a powerful faith and courage. When that is injured, it's as injured as a cut.
Yeah.
And the field doesn't realize that. So you just described with Imre that at a critical point in her life, her soul, as it's developing at 20, in terms of a creative person, was just damaged. Mm-hmm. And it's a real damage. We don't believe that that's really real, but I think I think we have a spiritual core within us, and that it functions to manage and drive us as human beings to the good parts of life, to our self-worth and dignity. And that gets injured. But we have yet to put that into neuroscience and to put that into biology, but I think someday we may be able to do that, because the experience of that damage to the soul is as real as a broken leg.
Yeah, yeah. And like you said, it's so important to raise that question of, is it possible to nurture it back, possible to heal it and stuff? Because I think that I look at my, English teachers in high school, right? Like, I wanted to be a writer, and I was submitting all sorts of crazy, like, I'm a professional writer today. I think I was a pretty good writer at the time, and that's it. I would go from getting the top grades to almost failing at times because I was just experimenting all over the map. And I think now I really respect all of the entire English department of my high school because they just treated me as that. Like, here's a creative guy doing creative stuff. They didn't, they never called in the counselor. They didn't call in the psychiatrist on me, right? Even though I'm sure that there was lots of things in there where they were kind of going
on the edge.
Yeah, where they go, ooh, there's some violence here, there's this or that, right? Like, what's this guy really doing? And they would they knew well because they did, I would come in and, why did you give me this mark? And we'd talk, but they were great. They were like, they would really share and talk with me. And so that prevented what you're talking about. That prevented that damage to my creative spirit, right? Because I think if in that moment they had called in and somebody had said, you got an illness, son, and you got a problem, that alone, without anything else happening, just that alone would have locked me in to a fight, and maybe I would have been strong enough, right? Because I was already pretty strong to fend it off, right, and survive.
Or you might have been beaten.
Or I might have been beaten, exactly. And forever had that question in my head. And when things went bad for me as an artist, I might have thought, oh, maybe I am just like ill or crazy and I can't do this, or all those things. And so, yeah, I think it's really important, as you're suggesting, to prevent that moment from ever occurring. But I like to believe, and I think it is possible, many people I've seen are finding healing pathways, right, with that kind of support, to identify it, just as you're saying, as a spiritual thing.
As
a
something
soul.
real, something important, and
Right.
can be an incredible opportunity for growth.
That's right. And let's go through it and let's find like how that struggle that's happened as a result of that has affected you, and what does repair for you look like on your terms? What does success look like coming out of that, or what does being reborn look like? And I think that's why one of the most important developments in all this for me is everybody's increasingly recognizes community as so important, that sense of connection with others, right? That if you as a psychiatrist can look in the eye of a patient, of a client, whatever you call them, and give them that reinforcement. Like, many people I talk to still are struggling with that power and difference. And they would find it enormously healing, I think, to have a psychiatrist, right? Just say to them, yeah, no, I don't think you are mentally ill. I don't think you were. I think this is what you went through, and just reinforcing their understanding of that alternative journey can be tremendous, right? And when they get it from others in their lives as well, then, right? Their family, very important for people to have that understanding of what they went through. And so, yeah, I think there's great, tremendous healing there that we can do as community now. I think that can happen outside of hospital settings, outside of professional settings. And in fact, I think the most important things will be there. But within those settings, that's what we can bring. We can bring that humanity, that soul, that, I do think it's transformative. And if there are more psychiatrists speaking out, that's what I keep saying. I just want them. I know they're under threat and they're under oppression, but hey, that's, so is everybody, right?
So that's a perfect opportunity for me to ask a final question. Part of why I'm in this film and this work is I think I've been able to build a good reputation and a career in psychiatry as part of the system. So maybe the system might listen to me with some of these messages. So I would like you, with all of this work you're doing and your dedication and what you're trying to do, to tell me, as the American Psychiatric Association, as if I'm all of the psychiatrists in the country, what is the message you really want us to hear in this film?
I think we've touched on them already, but I'll reiterate them for sure. So one is, let's just be a lot more honest here about what's really going on with everybody all the time. Like, talk more honestly about the questionable underpinnings of this as a science, and be more transparent about it as, in its finest, perhaps an art, and at its most dangerous, perhaps misinformation and deception and lying and manipulation. So let's work together, to be more clear. And let me think for a moment. What was my other one? So be more honest, and I slipped. I had two very clear messages to the American Psychiatric Association in my mind.
Be more honest.
Yes, that's one of the, and that's an important one. Oh, yes, the other one. And the other is, it's a form of honesty around this too, but just recognize how dangerous mental health laws have become, how off the rails the practice of involuntary commitment actually already is. And we gotta, like, even if you're not an abolitionist, even if you're not gonna go that far, recognize we are far, far off of where we need to be as a society in terms of what involuntary commitment should really look like, and I'd say break it down into the two pieces because they're very different. The notion of when you're trying to justify detaining someone, physically controlling them, because that's one thing. And then the notion of intervening in someone's brain with drugs or electroshock or whatever it is. These are two different things, so don't conflate them. Don't say they're the same thing. Don't mesmerize the public with that kind of stuff, but talk very clearly about what are the purposes of this and in what context, and let's really get back to like the heart of what that was originally, I guess, meant to be. I don't know.
Use it the way it was meant to be.
Right, like as the Supreme Court of the United States said it was supposed to be, right there, that's a debatable point, but at least it's a point where they said, they defined it in very specific terms. So let's at least talk in reference to that, and if you're not an abolitionist, let's speak in reference to that. So I'd say, yeah, just recognize how dangerous this law really is, how expansive it's become, and recognize it needs to be reined in. So it shouldn't be me and former patients speaking out. It should be psychiatrists too speaking out, saying, yes, involuntary commitment has become a real problem in our society. Let's try to get some real public dialogue happening, and some honesty happening around, not endless expansion, which is what we're getting right now. And psychiatrists, I have to accuse them and blame them because we have the evidence that their associations are, in fact, frequently campaigning, even to this day, for expansions to involuntary commitment powers constantly. They are not speaking out en masse. So it can't, I think psychiatrists should talk to their associations about this. Maybe that's where they need to start, to speak out in unison together, because any one gets brushed aside almost as quick as a former patient does. Yeah. So that's what I'd say. Like recently, California Psychiatric Association was one of the main pushers of the recent bevy of expansions to forced treatment in California.
To increase the forced treatment.
Yeah, to expand it, yeah. And it's going to be dramatic because California has so much money to throw at it, right? Billions and billions annually already planned for these expansions. So psychiatrists are really very much to blame for that. And I watched the testimony of the president of the Psychiatric Association. Well, guess what? He's also a board member of the Treatment Advocacy Center, which is the most aggressive pro-force lobby group in America. And he didn't disclose that openly. And he also happened to be the parent of a child who he'd had institutionalized. He was very proud and happy that his child was institutionalized against his will. And so that he disclosed, And so here you've got somebody who's clearly in a conflict of interest on every level, right? Both financially and politically and personally. And okay, we all have conflicts, but that's so extreme that really he should have said, I'm not the real person who should be here representing the association, right? In a neutral way to kind of present it. Instead, he was there campaigning. He was the first person the senator brought forth to testify to say, yeah, let's expand the definition of grave disability under the mental health law standard. So yeah, a very, very explicit role there. And psychiatrists could be speaking out and preventing that from happening. Thank you. Wow.
I have one question.
Okay,
That was
yeah.
the roll is the last one, and I'm going to sit in here next to my partner, my business partner. So, Dr. Chatlos, you and I are the two investors in this docuseries. So we have two investors.
You're both
From the
vesting.
beginning.
Wow.
Yes, like
I believe in it.
Sweet. Yeah. All
money.
right.
We have put money down.
All right.
And so here's just a question, and it's a conversation maybe. Why should investors invest in, and I'm going to say documentary, docuseries, and the feature movie, because it's one long project. We are looking to speak to mainstream. We're not going to speak to the choir behind the scenes. This is literally our initiative to get the word out using entertainment, using good media. Why should investors invest?
So why should they invest in this rather than put their money in other things that?
So, I mean, are we pitching this as that they're going to make money from it, or are we pitching it as
There's a
a
return
good
on
thing to do?
There's a
how do you
return
want
on
me to
it.
think
Well, if you think the public would benefit and would see this as useful, yeah, they'll make money on it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I
But
could
we
talk
need
about
their personal interest.
Yeah. Well, here's a few things. I mean, it's hard. Yeah. I'll just throw some things out. You know, if you find
Personal
any of it
opinion.
useful or whatever, follow up. So, first of all, we know that this is affecting millions of people annually, every year. And it's compounding. Like, this isn't the same people every year. We know that, so it's millions
And for
upon millions of
anyone
people.
committed, they've got a family.
That's right.
So it's not just those numbers that are being affected.
Exactly. And then we know that 20% of the population at any given time is taking a psychiatric medication, and we don't know how much of that is under coercion, essentially, right? And that doesn't include the institutionalized people, mind you, when they have those numbers. So the numbers of people that are engaged with these issues and concerned about them and feeling in some way pressure, because I think very few people really take a psychiatric medication even truly voluntarily, because usually it's they're struggling, right, in some way. So they're feeling, I
have to do it.
Yeah, that's right. So even if they do find it beneficial, and many people report that they do, so that's fine. But often it's still under coercion, right? That they might even then be thinking, yeah, I'm aware of the side effects. I wish I didn't have to. So they would like a lifestyle of doing it. So all of these people, tens of millions of people, really have an interest in this issue. And right now, we're prevented from getting to them because I think the mainstream media has a stake in not really presenting that critical view.
That's important.
That's very important. So that's why alternative media, independent media, people like yourselves are so important in this process right now, because it's the only way we're getting the message out. Who's buying my book right now? I got very few mainstream attention, reviews, interviews. I'm getting lots from people who are working independently, lots from patients and their families directly, right? All of that that's the interaction. They're the people that are spreading the word about it still. And it's the same thing. This is the kind of thing that can generate word of mouth, word of mouth spreading of the message around it. And right now, it's the only way. And so I think it's really important. And also highlights that you probably don't have competition, right? You're not going to, Warner Brothers probably isn't going to step up tomorrow and go, oh no, we're going to soak $20 million into one and you guys are going to be lost, right? So you're kind of, that's an opportunity for an investor to say, okay, we can be the first ones into this space, right? And we are seeing a growing awareness around some of these issues. My book is one attempt, and there are other attempts going on now to connect these dots. So that's something that an investor can help do, because when you're connecting dots, you've got a bigger, higher level message that needs to go to higher, it can go to higher levels within the media sphere or the business sphere, or any of these spheres. But you need money to do that. Like if I had $1 million to market my book, I do think it would make a difference, because I think right now it only sells at the rate it does because people just don't know about it. But when people read it, they are shocked, they are amazed, they are moved, they write to me. There's a lot of energy in these issues. That's the other thing I've noticed, and I think that's true. We are talking about people's lives being transformed, and they become really passionate about it. So there'll be other people that when you produce this will be excited about it and will help spread the message too. So it's the seed you need to lay, and then the more money you have along the way though, to continue to lay that seed, to continue to spread that message, it's so much more helpful. So I'd say that. In this sphere, I think $1 goes much further than in a lot of other spheres, because it multiplies. Yeah, it multiplies with the energy and passion that people feel about this issue that is out there and is really untapped. We've seen it. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is a great example. why that to this day resonates with the general public, right? To this day, that the impact of that. And it was part of a movement at the time, but it kind of is a good measure of if we can kind of continue to generate that grassroots movements, then these kinds of artistic and journalistic efforts will also have a bigger impact. And we are seeing that right now.
And you mentioned the dots, connecting the dots. In your connections with the psychiatric and mental health field, do you think there are enough dots, a lot of dots specifically looking at and talking about spirituality? Or not?
Well, I do think actually it's a good question, because I think that's one of the nerves that people relate to, right? That you can touch, because I do think there's been more legwork ahead of it. Like it came, all the work of Stanislav Grof for many years has been rooted in that, and he's had a tremendous influence on other practitioners and on particularly in the alternative practitioner space.
Not in traditional psychiatry.
Traditional psychiatry, yeah,
no.
Exactly. So we're outside
I didn't even hear about his name until I got involved with this.
Yeah, no, he's been blacklisted. He's made a lot of effort to try to get in some of his work, but he's not made it in. But yeah, so what question was I responding to here?
Your question about do you think there's enough dots
around spirituality
being brought out or in the field that you see already?
Because what was called the New Age movement, right? These are maybe not the language you want to use for your piece, but just as the idea went, like there is a huge interest in alternative approaches to health generally that are rooted in a broader understanding of life, spirituality, the inner strength of the human body, being in harmony with nature and with who we are, and that it is fundamentally a spiritual movement, the alternative health movement, I think. So they get this. So yeah, like some of the biggest podcasters that I've been interviewed by so far have been in that space, and they are already critiquing the pharmaceutical industry a lot. So they're anti-pharmaceuticals, they're anti that industry, they're already kind of critiquing government. They didn't like what happened during COVID, right? The sort of forcing the mandates, that kind of stuff, even if they're not necessarily anti-vaccination people as a whole. They just didn't like the lack of sort of nuance and critique there. And often those people do have a spiritual element within their thinking and approach. So I think you connect with that. And then I think also the conservative movement in the United States is intensely linked with the Christian movement. And I've been interviewed by those people, again, quite open to this idea, because they are seeing it as an invasion upon individual rights and family rights, right? Even more so. So the libertarian movement in the United States has long had that understanding of a critique of forced treatment, and now it is spread into the somewhat more broader understanding within Christianity. I think that, look, there's something here that we also don't want to crush. So we're seeing both right now. There is a Christian movement, the church movement, that is very much like, oh, we're trying to help those poor people by oppressing, by getting them locked up, getting them treated. So we're seeing that right now. But I think also we're seeing an alternative Christian movement rising, recognizing that no, this wasn't supposed to be about oppressing.
And this is inhuman.
Right? Yeah, this is inhuman, and it's anti-family, and it's too much state intervention and state control. So I think these are some of the kind of connections that you can potentially make with something like this, to recognize that, that with that broader sense of what sort of spirituality means to us all. Yeah, so I do think there's something there.
So we have plenty of stuff right in this to get investors.
We do. But here's a question.
Some of that was great.
Yeah.
Here's a question to wrap this.
Go.
There is a piece of research, I can't quote it right now, that says Hollywood is paying attention more to faith-based entertainment, faith-based movies, meaning paying attention, meaning investing, buying, producing. Right. True stories, things are all based on true stories. So faith-based, true stories, and then the whole movement and expansion of documentaries, docuseries. So I put those together and then again say gut.
Being real life
Yeah. Real
focus.
Yes, but still faith-based.
Yeah.
in a feature movie. So I just put that together with the second piece that Netflix just bought a major piece of land in New Jersey on an army base.
Oh, really?
On an
Wow.
army base.
Right down the road.
And so the whole New Jersey Film Commission is, looking at the whole explosion of the industry. And I'm rattling here for a second, but I just recently found out that Hollywood was really started in New Jersey. So we had the first Hollywood,
Yeah.
then we know where it went, but it seems like with Netflix buying this property, that the whole film industry is going to be woken up in New Jersey.
Wow, yeah.
So
That is, it's already
Right.
started.
so piecing that together, gut. I already know what I'm assuming is going to happen. But what's your gut piecing those together and what we're doing with this film? That there is no competition at the moment in mainstream around this.
Well, Netflix is a good example because we have seen, I think they ran I Care a Lot. They ran, they've run a number of things. I think they just put out one on the troubled teen industry, right? So they're getting it. And so it is, I think, just a matter of it's, it's still a story, right? All of this is driven by story, character story. And so the pitch has to be good. But I don't think that they're anywhere near as against this in principle as, say, the New York Times is, or, just a run-of-the-mill sort of average media outlet or something like that. I think you're right. Your gut is correct, and more than your gut, we're seeing the evidence already in the space of places like Netflix that are producing outside the box stuff, bringing in things from other countries too. So yeah, I think the opportunities there. I mean, I've been thinking about it myself a lot. What's the pitch I could do, that might fit this kind of thing? And is it fictional or is it nonfiction? And in what frame, And there are problems with what my book in that vein, because so many people don't want their faces on camera to say I was committed, right? So many people don't want their names, and it's really hard. Like I have talked with a very high-profile director about what we could do together. He does short form stuff, and he was very open. Like he got it immediately. He asked me great questions, and I just seen one thing he did that was kind of connected, and I went, okay, you kind of get this. Let me pitch you some more, and we talked for quite a while. And like I say, he was asking all the right questions, inspired me totally. He was fully open. He said, "Yep, send me a pitch," but I just haven't, because he had certain criteria, and it was, for example, I want people who've been committed within the last 3 years who are going to put their real name and their face on camera, because without that, I got nothing. And I was like, it's been hard because often people are still recovering. They might still be on the meds. So they might, aren't talking that fluently or whatever. And you got this uphill battle. And so I just kind of let it slide, even though he was going to be paying me and everything, right? There'd be a contract. So yeah, it remains to be seen what that pitch is, but I believe that Netflix would be totally open. So I think you're right on it there. Is Sarah still working on her movie? Because she was working on a movie at one point.
We'll do that as part two. Sarah and I are talking about combining forces.
Right.
And
Okay.
co-producing a very specific documentary
Right.
that combines her story, my story, and many stories from around the world,
Right.
which we've been collecting. So stay tuned. We'll
Right.
get Sarah into here very,
Okay.
very soon.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
All right.
We're good?
Yeah. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was
I
awesome. Yeah.
appreciated hearing
Yeah.
and